Okay, I'm back with part two of the Astrology of Scientology. Now, this is turning into a three-part case study because there's there's a lot of information surrounding the Church of Scientology. So, part two is going to be on more on L. Ron Hubbard's chart, and then I'm going to get into the chart of David Miscavige. Here he is right here next to L. Ron Hubbard. He is the leader of the Church of Scientology now, so he is the successor of L. Ron Hubbard. And then in part three, I'm going to get into the charts of John Travolta, Tom Cruise, and Leah Remini. So these are some key players in the Church of Scientology. Leah Remini has spoken out against the Church of Scientology after she has broken away from it. So it'll be interesting to see what's in her chart that caused her to break away. So let's get back into L. Ron Hubbard's chart. So L. Ron Hubbard, as you can see, he is a weird looking dude, or he was a weird looking dude. And just looking into his eyes really creeps me out. So all you need is like a basic level of discernment to be able to see that there's something off with this guy. So I would think that a person with a normal or basic level of discernment will automatically kind of recoil seeing him. But then, there was other people that loved this man, and they, trusted him, and they believed in what he was saying and all of that. And you'll notice that people like that, they do have a strong influence of Pisces and or Neptune in their charts, which makes them just naturally susceptible to this type of indoctrination. So like I said in part one, his ascendant is at the 20th degree of Sagittarius. That Sagittarius ascendant brings the theme of religion into view, but the 20th degree can also pertain to real estate. So I see that as him being a wealthy landowner when you take the 20th degree of Sagittarius into account. And the 20th degree can deal with the awakening. It is the number of the awakening. And he had several throughout his life, especially when he formed the Sea Org branch of the Church of Scientology. And he actually started sailing around the world, spreading his message of Scientology. However, the 20th degree of Sagittarius can also pertain to his claim of dying on the operating room table, especially when you take into account Jupiter and Scorpio, his chart ruler. So I'm going to get into that about the story that he told about him dying on the operating table very shortly. Now, his Jupiter, ruler of his ascendant, which is also makes it his chart ruler, is at the 14th degree of Scorpio in the 11th house. Like I mentioned in part one, that deals with the whole science fiction theme. But that 14th degree, which I really didn't talk about in part one, that is a degree of movement and challenge, or you could say challenges with moving forward. So this is mainly pointing to his tax issues. So he was trying to evade the IRS throughout his life. And even when he was still leader of the Church of Scientology, his organization still wasn't given that tax exempt status. That came along when David Miscavige took charge. So the 14th degree can bring major financial gains, especially when it's the 14th degree of Scorpio, but it can also bring losses. And like I said before, that Jupiter and Scorpio as his chart ruler makes him very controversial, but also very influential. So with part one, I was reading from this article, and I believe it was like the first sentence where the person was talking about how he was one of the most controversial, but also one of the most influential. And in part one, I focused more so on the controversial part, but I was like, that influential part is very much Scorpio as well, because Scorpio is the most influential sign of the zodiac. So this Jupiter in Scorpio can also lead one to prominence. It can result in attracting a large following because it's in the 11th house. And also, like I said, it's pertaining to the whole science fiction theme, especially the dark side of it because of that Scorpio influence. But if you notice, most science fiction is on the dark side. Now, his Jupiter is conjoined to the South Node, like I mentioned in part one, but I don't think I got into the numerology. So his South Node's at the 12th degree, and that 12th degree is dealing with sacrifice and victimization. And that's a very strong theme in his life because he had his Church of Scientology members basically sacrifice their life for the organization, especially his Sea Org members. And then he was engaging in a lot of victimization of people. So that really comes into play with that South Node at the 12th degree of Scorpio. Now, with this conjunction, this points to him being drawn to the dark side, being naturally devious, demonic, perhaps channeling demonic energies because of the 11th house influence, him being a fraud, where he said that religion is the way to make money or the only way to make money or something to that effect. Go back to part 1 to get the actual quote. And this can create a God complex within him, and where he could be very compulsive, obsessive, ugly, weird looking, because Jupiter is ruling his first house and it's conjoined to that South Node. That 11th house can make him weird looking. He said he died on an operating table when he was getting some dental surgery and he was put under or whatever. And when he basically died, he so-called left his body. He entered some gates and he received some knowledge of the mysteries of the universe or whatever. And this inspired him to write this book called Excalibur, also known as Black Sword. And he stated that whoever read the book would be driven insane or they would be driven to commit suicide, which wasn't true because people have read the book and they've been perfectly fine. Now, it came out later that it was actually his hallucinations brought on by nitrous oxide due to his tooth extraction surgery. And he does have Mars conjoined to Uranus and Capricorn, and that can produce problems with teeth. So that's interesting. But to his credit, I will say that he probably did leave his body because he got Jupiter conjoined to the Scorpio South Node, which can make him prone to astral travel astrally, have out of body experiences. And he could have been having those from an early age. His Jupiter is in trine to his Mercury and Sun. Like I said in part 1, this deals with science fiction and him being a fantasy writer. Also, him being the creator of the Church of Scientology, him amassing devotees, slaves, especially with the Sea Org, because those people, they were basically slaves. Also, his time in the Navy and his fascination with the Navy, his fascination with sea life. He was also a hypnotist. So I watched a couple of documentaries last night, so I learned some more interesting facts about L. Ron Hubbard, the Church of Scientology, David Miscavige, all that good stuff. So I took a lot of that into account when I was looking at his chart again. Also, you could look at this as him being mesmerizing. Now, he may not have been able to mesmerize everybody, but he did mesmerize a good number of people, even through his book Dianetics alone. And this whole Jupiter trine Mercury and the Sun, that can point to the whole Dianetics book and how that created this wave of devotees. His Mars is conjoined to Uranus and Capricorn in the 2nd house. That can make him a pervert. He could have been bisexual. Even though homosexuality, bisexuality was frowned upon in the Church of Scientology, I see L. Ron Hubbard as being a closet bisexual. Also, you could just look at that as him being a weirdo, him being into dark forms of kink, like perhaps getting electroshocks on his penis. I say that because Mars is conjoined to Uranus in Capricorn. That Capricorn influence can produce masochism, sadism. So he probably had a little bit of both. He was probably into that S&M. This conjunction can also cause him to be a sci-fi buff, which he was, a technology buff, where he's into aliens, and he created this alien god called Xenu or whatever, and he talked about Thetans and how there was these entities that were all over people's bodies and stuff, and that was the whole point of getting clear. Clear was his term that he used for healing people, removing these Thetans off of their bodies. Like, this is some really weird stuff. Also, this points to him starting a movement and being a tyrannical cult leader. The cult leader part comes into the fact that this conjunction's in the 2nd house. Now, Aquarius is intercepted in his 2nd house. That's him creating the E meter. when the conjunction between Uranus and Mars is taken into account, because Uranus rules Aquarius. This also made him have a huge sense of entitlement. It made him a nonconformist, also where he's a science fiction freak, where he felt alien, even probably growing up in his family, and Mars rules his fourth house, and where he had many conveniences. Also, this points to him having extremist values and him being unreasonable in terms of his standards. Mars is conjoined to Uranus and is forming a quincunx with his Virgo moon. That right there I see as him attempting to create a moon child. Go back to part 1 to get more insight into that. So he tried to create a moon child with his friend Jack Parsons. And this whole moon child motif comes from Aleister Crowley. And both Jack Parsons, he's a very interesting character to study as well. I might do a video on him. Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard were both big-time followers of Aleister Crowley. I think L. Ron Hubbard used to write Aleister Crowley up quite a bit when he was still alive. I think he was like one of his main biggest fans or whatever. So this moon child was supposed to become the Antichrist. Also, this quincunx deals with the love triangle involving L. Ron Hubbard, Jack Parsons, and Jack Parsons' girlfriend, or maybe it was his wife. But he ended up marrying this woman, but the Church of Scientology is trying to say that that's not true. Now, I feel that he couldn't resist stealing her from Jack Parsons because of her very submissive nature, which is evidenced by that Virgo moon. Also, this points to him having a huge sense of entitlement when it comes to other men's women, with his moon in the 8th house, and where he had to manage all those servants that were attending to him. So he had his servants do everything for him, including light his cigars and hold his ashtrays while he smoked. Also, this quincunx can point to his tiered auditing levels that cost his members thousands of dollars. So like in the Joe Rogan interview with Leah Remini, she said that by the time she got to the 5th level, I forgot what level she was on, but she said she had already spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to get up to that level. So you could see this quincunx as him just stringing these members along and having them keep on paying through the auditing. The auditing comes in with that Virgo moon in the 8th house. That represents the auditing. Mars and Uranus are squaring Saturn and Taurus. You can see this as his inability to operate as a sole leader due to tax purposes, hence his advices. So I found out last night that in order to be responsible for taxes, L. Ron Hubbard could not openly be the leader of the Church of Scientology, where it looked like he was benefiting from the proceeds of the Church of Scientology. So he came up with a solution where he was still dictating how things should go, but he was writing anonymous letters or memos, and he called them his advices. And Taurus is the sign of advice. So that makes a lot of sense. So that was how he was able to maintain control while operating undercover through those advices. Also, this square is where he kept instituting more and more draconian policies every time he felt that he was losing control, and where he was very unreasonable. So he did do that, like every time somebody would get out of line, or even if he just felt like he wasn't in total control, he would make things even more strict for his members. He was very unreasonable, and the square could point to where he had a lot of followers, but he had contempt for them, and where he belittled them. His sun in Pisces is squaring Pluto and Gemini. Now with that, I'm seeing dead children or a dead child. A lot of times with sun square Pluto, some child is dying that you're connected to. So it could be your own child or a child that you know, what have you. You could even be involved in the death of that child, whether it's murder or whatever. A lot of times it will be murder, or as you'll see a little later on. Now, he had a murderous streak with that, because remember, he supposedly accidentally started shooting at these these Korean forces. Also, him being obsessive compulsive, especially with writing. So he has written the most science fiction books ever. And his Pluto is in Gemini, which can deal with being obsessive or compulsive with writing. But I'm also looking at this did he also plagiarize some of that material? Because Pluto is in the 7th house. That could deal with other people's writing. And his sun in Pisces just, makes him prone to steal. Also, this square is where rejection turns into hatred. So he felt rejected all his life and became a hater as a result. This also points to him being hated, being exposed. And one of the times he was exposed is when he did this experiment with this student. Student is dealing with that Gemini energy. And basically he was coaching the student by giving her certain eye contact and body language and stuff. And when they told the student to turn around, because the judges or whatever, they peeped what was going on. And when they saw that when she turned around and he could no longer influence her and she couldn't answer those questions, then that's when they call him a fraud. Also, betraying others, even friends like Parson. Now, Pluto is in the 7th and it's ruling the 11th. 11th house deals with friends. So he stole Parson's woman and he stole some of Parson's money. Also, L. Ron Hubbard accused people of engaging in sinister interventions to take him down. And that's very much Sun square Pluto. That aspect can produce extreme paranoia. And he would cry and throw things. So he had, some emotional outbursts or meltdowns. That's very much indicative of this Sun square Pluto aspect. The crying part is definitely dealing with his Sun in Pisces. Also, he kidnapped his 13-month-old daughter as a control tactic. He gave his son amphetamines, and his son was only like 3 or 4 at the time. My memory serves me correctly. The son started talking gibberish, and L. Ron Hubbard used that gibberish for subject matter of his book, one of his books. Also, there was an incident of L. Ron Hubbard putting a 4-year-old boy in a chain locker on a ship for 2 days without food or water. He had to go to the bathroom on himself, all that type of stuff. And this was for chewing his telex. Now, I don't know what a telex is. Is it something dealing with navigation or whatever it might have been? But this is when he was on the ship in the Sea Org branch. He also punished his son for being gay because, like I said, homosexuality is frowned upon in the Church of Scientology. I don't know if that's still the case, but it was in the past. So he punished his son for being gay, and then his son tried to commit suicide, and L. Ron Hubbard punished his son even further for that. But his son did accomplish the whole suicide later on. So his son ended up committing suicide. So that's very much related to that Sun square Pluto. And also, he committed suicide after being sentenced to the Gulag-style RHP organization. So there was these different branches of the Church of Scientology, and some of them were very much like where the people were enslaved and humiliated. Now, towards the end of his life, he ended up living in seclusion for the rest of his life, and he really let himself go. So when they found him, his hair had overgrown, his nails were super long. Also, I see this as demonic influence that he was under, and basically him being a psychopath. His Pluto is opposed to the asteroid Arachne. Arachne is at the 25th degree of Sagittarius. You can see this as him weaving a web in terms of Scientology centers all over the world. You can look at this as him creating a network of Scientology centers. I also see this as him having a goon squad, which the Church of Scientology does. So they will perform private investigations on people, especially people that have broken away from the church or who are trying to break away. Also, they will stalk people, gang stalk, all types of stuff, do things to fuck with their mind. And you can see this as also him attempting to get around tax obligations. That 25th degree of Sagittarius, that 25 is very much dealing with him being at sea. And then the sun is conjoined to Estrella. That's an asteroid that can deal with where you take things way too far. So this is him going too far with the lies, the fantasies, the delusions, going too far with his enslavement of some of his members, and also with humiliating them, and maybe going too far with drugs. Also, you can point to this representing the Sea Org branch of the Church of Scientology alone, and him being at sea, literally and figuratively. So being at sea in the figurative sense can deal with somebody that's not all there mentally, or like they've lost their mind, or they're just out of it. Also drunk with power. And this is another aspect that points to the tax evasion and his reclusive tendencies, which got carried away at the end of his life. You can also say paranoia as well. His vertex is at the 3rd degree of Leo. It's running parallel to Arcturus. Arcturus is one of the most fortunate fixed stars in the heavens. And that 3rd degree of Leo deals with his ability to exercise unfettered free will while at sea. Also him having unmitigated power while at sea, because nobody was bothering him. Nobody really knew what he was doing. A lot of times he was out in the middle of nowhere. Sea voyages. So benefiting from sea voyages, that's one of the manifestations of Arcturus. So that's very interesting that this is prominent in his chart. And also Arcturus can deal with where you take a different approach. And Arcturus can bless a person with wealth and fame. So all of that applies to L. Ron Hubbard. His North Node is conjoined to Menkar. Remember, his North Node is in Taurus, and I talked about Taurus being the sign of the cult leader. So this Menkar can deal with unconscious drives that suddenly emerge. Also where the person can be a victim of the unconscious, or you could say maybe even demonic influence. Disease, disgrace, unjustified beefs, animosities, and conflicts. His ascendant is conjoined to Hygeia, which is an asteroid that pertains to health, but especially like doctors and health practitioners, healers. So this is him claiming to heal people through alternative holistic health methods like auditing. Also, could this mean that he had a blood disorder or a blood-borne disease or whatever, because Sagittarius does deal with the blood. And his ascendant is conjoined to the fixed star Ras Al-Hag, and this can pertain to him healing through mystical methods, but it also can pertain to him having perverted desires, which reinforces that Mars conjoined to Uranus. Ras Al-Hag can also produce trouble with women. It can pertain to drugs. It can produce hallucinations. And, you know, remember I talked about how he was under that nitrous oxide and he was hallucinating. So, yes, he was very prone to hallucinations. Poisoning. Maybe he had poisoned some people. You never know. I think this man was capable of doing anything. And also infections. His Jupiter is conjoined to Zubin el-Janubi. This can produce loss, theft, and he did steal from his friend Jack Parsons. And Jupiter's in the 11th house. Betrayal, he betrayed Jack Parsons. Also abuse, STDs, poisoning. So poisoning shows up again. So I wouldn't be surprised if he poisoned some people that weren't adhering to his standards. Drowning. This is the interesting thing that I found out last night. So when he was in that Sea Org, when he was at sea and he was dealing with the members that didn't want to comply or they were misbehaving or whatever, he would throw them overboard. Now, supposedly nobody died in the process because they would pull them back up. But that alone is evil and sadistic. Throwing them overboard. What if some of them couldn't really swim well or couldn't swim at all? He didn't care. He probably was hoping that some of them died. And I think he probably did kill some people. And this is all speculation on my part. But I wouldn't be surprised if he did kill some people by throwing them overboard, especially because this fixed star is on his Jupiter. So it's like, yeah. Drowning. Drowning, you don't survive out of drowning. It can deal with possible drowning, but you already know. Now, anguish, revenge, and criminality, that's also possible manifestations of this star. And going back to the drowning thing, his Jupiter does rule the 12th house, and the 12th house can deal with drowning. Jupiter is opposed to Eurydice. That's an asteroid that can pertain to death. But I'm seeing that in particular as him causing someone's death. So if you combine this opposition with Jupiter conjoined to Zubin el-Janubi, then maybe he did cause some deaths by throwing them overboard. Also, Eurydice can deal with being stalked or where he's stalking. His Mercury is conjoined to Achenar, which can bring benefits through religion. So this definitely applies to his life in the Church of Scientology. And this can deal with him having access to other realms and dimensions. So remember I talked about him having that out-of-body experience or that near-death experience. That's what I mean. He very well could have had something like that. Like maybe he just really went in with that nitrous oxide and he allowed it to really take him. Like he's already prone to just having access to other dimensions because of that strong Pisces energy he's dealing with, and with Jupiter conjoined to that South Node in Scorpio. So I believe it that he was able to access other dimensions. That might have been how he became demonically influenced even. And Archanor can deal with success in public office. Chiron is conjoined to the fixed star Deneb Adige, and that can deal with writing ability. It can deal with originality, creativity, makes him very good with the public, and it pertains to astrology. So he more than likely was versed in astrology. Aleister Crowley was well versed in astrology. So if he was an adherent of Aleister Crowley, more than likely he studied astrology too. And with that Mars conjoined to Uranus, Aquarius intercepted in the second, I'm sure that he was very knowledgeable of astrology. Now let's get into David Miscavige. So in part one, I mispronounced his name. I said Miscavige, but it's pronounced Miscavige. So I have to keep saying Miscavige so I don't mispronounce it. So let's get into his chart. So again, he is the current leader of the Church of Scientology. His title is chairman of the board of the Church of Scientology. This is the top dog. This is the one that basically calls all the shots now. And he is the successor of L. Ron Hubbard. So David Miscavige's sun is at the 10th degree of Taurus. Surprise! Remember I said Taurus is the sign of the cult leader. So this is perfect for a cult leader. Now David was born April 30th, 1960. His life path number is 23. That breaks down to 5. 23 is known as the royal star of the lion, and it can make one highly favored and very much loved and adored, especially by people in authority. So that goes well with his life. So the 10th degree in terms of his birth number, that can produce someone that's easily influenced. It can deal with I like to call it the come up degree, because a person can come up through their associations with others. The 10th degree pertains to his relationship to his father, and also it could deal with a child or children. The 10th degree also produces leadership potential. Keyword on potential, because that's where that 0 comes in. His sun is running parallel to the nebula. The nebula can produce mental illness. It can deal with going against society. It can produce undesirable associates, control, disease, despair, catastrophe, but it can make someone be the recipient of honors, or they could be deemed an honorable person. The sun is opposed to his Neptune. That can deal with him being like akin to a slave master, but also in the beginning of his life where he was trapped in a cult because his father joined the Church of Scientology when he was only 7 years old. He got his first auditing session at 9 years old. So this points to his own enslavement, but now he's become like the slave master. Also, this opposition points to lacking a strong sense of self or pride, where he has false pride, where he's lacking free will or the will to be his own individual person. Now, his father later on escaped the cult once David became the leader. And then his father went out on a smear campaign against David. His father wrote a book called Ruthless, which I'll get into in a minute. Now, while his father was still a member of the Church of Scientology, he joined the Sea Org, which again, that's the most oppressive branch of the Church of Scientology. That's where people actually like become slaves for the leader. Back in the day, it was L. Ron Hubbard. Now they're slaves for David Miscavige. So the father joined the Sea Org branch, and he said that David acted like he didn't even know him, like that wasn't even his father anymore. I guess because now the father was at such a lowly status. But the reason why the father joined the Sea Org was because it was like he was paying penance to David and the Church of Scientology, because the father was charged with sexual assault. And David got him off. So he did, the charges were dropped, or he was acquitted or whatever. And that was very much due to David's influence. So to show his gratitude and to pay penance, his father joined the Sea Org. Now, his father seems very shady in and of himself. So, but also the Sun opposition Neptune deals with him being out of touch with reality, and also where he can't find happiness. He has Sun square Uranus. This can produce an antisocial person where he's uncompromising and humane, cold, heartless, can have an indifference towards suffering, disagreeable, odd, eccentric in a bad way. And if you watch some of the documentaries on him, you'll see that this very much applies to him. His father said he had a very strong will from an early age. Also, Sun square Uranus points to him being estranged from his father. So even today, him and his father don't fuck with each other. Like, they don't get along at all. And like I said, his father wrote a book called Ruthless, which can be very much representative of this Sun square Uranus aspect. So he wrote this book called Ruthless, where he's basically talking trash about his son and talking about how his son, was this, great guy. And then when he became leader of the Church of Scientology, he became ruthless and cold and all this type of stuff. But Ron, I really question his motives, and I just see him as being a slimeball piece of shit father, which I'll get more into in a minute. Now, David's sun is in trine to Pluto. That can lead to a lot of power and prominence. It can make one very influential. And this points to the private investigator that David has hired at $10,000 per week to spy on his own father. Also, this points to David being Hubbard's successor and where he got the tax-exempt status for the church. So it was due to David's influence that he was able to get the tax-exempt status. Mercury is conjoined to Venus in Aries. With this aspect, is either his way or the highway. So it's a good aspect for a cult leader, especially in terms of him public speaking and espousing the values of the cult of Scientology, Church of Scientology. Also, I found out that he had a twin sister. So when I was looking at this conjunction, when you take into account that Mercury rules siblings, I was like, looks like, perhaps his sister could have taken most of the nutrients when they were in utero, making him hungry for power. So that can happen with twins, where one twin, usually that does happen, where one twin's taking more of the nutrients and whatever like that. And then, there's a lot of twins that come out where one's more happy-go-lucky, the other one's more reserved or more low-key or even kind of like depressed. So a lot of times you will see that dichotomy between twins. And my theory is because one of those twins weren't given enough nutrients in the womb. So I see in this case where perhaps his sister was taking most of the nutrients, especially because we're talking about Aries. So that could deal with, a conflict even between him and his sister, even in the womb. And for twins like that, the one that wasn't getting enough nutrients, they will overcompensate when they get outside of the womb for the lack of power that they had inside of the womb. So I just thought that was interesting. His Mercury is in quincunx to his Virgo North Node. Both are at the 22nd degree. That 22nd can deal with some challenging situations where you don't have much control or where you are wielding total control. So again, he was born with severe asthma, so I see that possibly being his sister's influence. Again, him being in a weakened state from birth or all automatically in utero, and him having that asthma as a result. Now, his father claims that his first auditing session, which he had at 9, helped to keep it under control, helped to keep the asthma under control. So he claimed that David became a staunch advocate and a believer of the Church of Scientology at age 9. And in this interview, his father was like, because the interviewer was like, "Are you sure?" And he was like, "Oh, definitely. This was like," he was so sure in himself that this was the moment when David became utterly convicted about the Church of Scientology and all this type of stuff. And I just thought that was kind of suspicious, which I'll get into more in a little bit. Now, moving along, David's moon is in Cancer opposing Jupiter. Now, it just so happens that David's wife, Shelley, has been missing for the past few years, or maybe a couple of years. And Leah Remini has been very vocal about David's wife being missing. She actually started asking questions about David's wife, her whereabouts, when she was still in the Church of Scientology, and she got spanked for it. She actually got written up and all types of stuff for, asking questions. His moon could be conjoined to Diana. Now, I'm not sure what time he was born, so I'm not sure exactly what degree that moon is at, but I would think that the arbitrary birth time that I have for him, which is around 3 in the afternoon, that could be in the ballpark, because this conjunction right here can deal with where he's looking for his wife. Moon opposition Jupiter can deal with where she fled. She got ghosts. She was like, I'm done with it. She freed herself. His south node is at the 22nd degree of Pisces, and like I said, that 22nd can be very challenging. It will produce situations involving submission and caution, or where you have to take a very submissive position. It can also produce situations where you are being controlled or you are in control. Usually there is no middle ground with that. Either you're being controlled or you're in total control. So he's been on both sides of the 22 spectrum. When he was a kid and a young adult, he was being totally controlled. And now he's in total control as the leader of the Church of Scientology. That Pisces can also deal with him being utterly devoted, the Pisces South Node, him living that cult life because he was indoctrinated from an early age, him being delusional, paranoid, and also him being a slave to Hubbard and Scientology, especially when he became a Sea Org member. Mars is conjoined to his South Node. That can deal with him becoming drunk with power once he gets it. But in the beginning, where he was enslaved to Scientology and L. Ron Hubbard, where he lacked individuality and a strong sense of self, he lacked self-determination. This can also be a narcissistic aspect, because there's a strong correlation between Neptune and Pisces and narcissism when you combine it with Mars and the Sun, also like energy like Leo. Possible sex slave, that's what I'm seeing that as. So I'm seeing that perhaps his father could have sacrificed him to the cult from an early age, basically handed him over to L. Ron Hubbard. Now his Saturn, which is representing his father, is in sextile to the South Node. And his father did become prominent in some way. I forget what it was, but it looks like, I think his father was trying to be a musician and he actually recorded some records and stuff. So maybe that's what he got in exchange for handing his son over to be L. Ron Hubbard's sex slave. More on this in a minute. His Mars and South Node are in sextile square to his Neptune, so this reinforces the themes of being drunk with power, the narcissistic themes, the secrets, sexual victimization, slavery, spies even, and hiding his true sexuality or sexual identity or sexuality. Saturn is at the 18th degree of Capricorn. It's in trine to his Virgo North Node. This can deal with him being the perfect disciple, the dutiful servant, and him being groomed, maybe even sexually, because that 18 can be a very sexual degree. That 18 is a very beastly degree. It can even be a murderous degree. It is a degree of serious conflict between one's spiritual and material values in particular. His Mercury is conjoined to Psyche. That can produce mental illness, mental torture, and I see that as him being under mind control. And if you look at that picture or just Google pictures of him, he looks like he is a mind control slave. He doesn't look all there. Now, this is a really telling aspect. His Saturn is opposed to Sappho. His Saturn is at the 18th degree of Capricorn. Sappho is at the 18th degree of Cancer. So with this, I see this as him being punished for being gay, maybe by his own father, but maybe his father could have had something to do with his exposure to homosexuality from an early age, because, like I said, I wouldn't be surprised if his father actually handed him over to L. Ron Hubbard when he was young. Degradation or degradation type sex could be going on. S&M type sex, perhaps with Hubbard. And this could deal with being groomed by an older man, an older gay male for, gay sexual practices or whatever, because Sappho is an asteroid that can deal with homosexuality. Now, David South, oh, here's the synastry between David and L. Ron Hubbard. So it's very telling, the connection between the two. Now, David's South Node is conjoined to L. Ron Hubbard's sun. This right here points to David being Hubbard's top devotee, his loyal slave, and this denotes a past life connection. Perhaps L. Ron Hubbard could have been David's father in a past life. I wouldn't be surprised because they had a very close connection like that, and it seemed like it was destined, with David's son being on L. Ron Hubbard's North Node. Also sacrificing his life for the cult created by L. Ron Hubbard. David's South Node is conjoined to L. Ron Hubbard's Mercury. Basically, this is David becoming immersed in Hubbard's books, his teachings, and where he believed anything that Hubbard said. And this is about David signing the billion years contract when he entered the Sea Org. So the Sea Org members have to sign a billion years contract, which basically says that they are pledging their allegiance to the Church of Scientology in this lifetime and in all their future lifetimes. So this just shows you how crazy L. Ron Hubbard was. David's Pluto is conjoined to L. Ron Hubbard's moon. That can be an aspect of sexual relations. In the very least, it does denote a very close bond that existed between the two of them. It can point to David being obsessed with L. Ron Hubbard. Also, where David was L. Ron's most convicted servant with that Virgo influence. And also where he had David's unwavering support. I even think that David would have died for L. Ron Hubbard. And where David intensified L. Ron Hubbard's influence, but also his personality. It was like he fueled it. David's sun is conjoined to L. Ron Hubbard's Taurus North Node, like I was saying. So this points to David being the chosen one, the leader, cult leader, because of the Taurus influence of Hubbard's Scientology cult. David's Uranus is enshrined to L. Ron Hubbard's Venus. This is a perfect aspect, meaning there is no space between these planets and aspects. So it's at the 0 degree, 0 minute in terms of order, which means that it's perfect. So I see this as totally unified with Hubbard, where he had unwavering loyalty to the cause, Scientology cause that is, and where he was Hubbard's #1 fan, where he was invited into Hubbard's circle, and where he was entitled to what Hubbard had upon his death. But I also see this as David being L. Ron Hubbard's robot, because I believe that L. Ron Hubbard mind controlled David from an early age. And also this can point to magnetic attraction. So like when they met up, it was like this instant connection. Dad, son. Now David's Mars is squaring L. Ron's Pluto, and this can be an aspect of sexual abuse and physical abuse. And perhaps L. Ron Hubbard was playing mind games with David. I'm sure he was, because he was that type of individual. And there could have been some shaming going on, especially in terms of David's sexuality. Even though, they could have been lovers, or, David could have been L. Ron Hubbard's sex slave. But, like I said, L. Ron Hubbard, he looked down upon homosexuality on the outward in terms of the Church of Scientology. But I feel like he was one of those hypocrites. He was a Sag rising, that's a sign of the hypocrite. He was one of those hypocrites that bashed gays, but was secretly bisexual himself. Or maybe even outright gay, but he tolerated women just to further his cause or whatever. Now, David's Jupiter is enshrined with L. Ron Hubbard's moon. This deals with him being a willing and faithful servant of Hubbard, also where he had access to Hubbard's intimate circle, and where he was willing to do whatever it took to appease Hubbard's temperamental nature. And then last but not least, we have what I consider to be the damning aspect that points to the darker connection between these two. So David's Saturn, remember David's Saturn is opposing Sappho at the 18th degree of Cancer, is opposing L. Ron Hubbard's Neptune at the 18th degree of Cancer. That means that David's Sappho which is the homosexual asteroid, is conjoined to L. Ron Hubbard's Neptune, both at the 18th degree of Cancer. I already told you how that 18 can play out. So that's all the confirmation I need. I see Hubbard as making David his sex slave and degrading him even down to mocking his homosexuality. Basically, David was his perfect disciple and mind-controlled sex slave in terms of my opinion. This is my assessment. And he became the unrivaled choice for the leader of the cult of Scientology. Now, one thing to keep in mind about sexual abuse, especially when it's done to a kid, and that person has a close relationship with the abuser, what will happen is called the Stockholm Syndrome, where they will start to identify with their abuser. They will start to come to really love and be dependent upon their abuser. And they can be turned into a perfect mind-controlled slave as a result of repeated abuse over and over, especially if you get that kid around the age of 7. So even though the father is saying that David didn't get that auditing until age 9, you never know. L. Ron Hubbard could have had access to David as early as age 7. And 7 is that magic age that Aleister Crowley's talked about. If I'm not mistaken, y'all correct me if I'm wrong, where he was saying that's the perfect age to do a ritual or sacrifice or whatever like this. So while David wasn't sacrificed in terms of the physical sense, because he's still alive, his soul was sacrificed in order for him to take over the reins of the Church of Scientology, because L. Ron Hubbard was such a control freak. He wasn't going to allow just anybody to take over. So he would have to create the perfect robot or the perfect puppet to carry on his name and his legacy. So that's part 2. Let me know what you think. I'll be back with part 3. If you would like a reading, you could go to my website at rabina.com. Just click order a reading up at the top. Stay tuned for the next part.